Emily Dickinson is the greatest poet that ever was. And I want to talk about it. I've got 5 thoughts on Emily Dickinson. And look, you can say that maybe the greatest poet of all time was William Shakespeare, maybe it was William Blake, maybe it was Langston Hughes, maybe it was Charles Bukowski, whoever it is, you want to say that is the greatest poet of all time, and that's fine. Those are all very good answers. But they're wrong. It's Emily Dickinson, and we're going to go through a little bit of why here. I believe that the real way to sort of measure literature is to tell the big through the small, or to tell the small through the big. What does that mean? It sounds like such a stupid statement, and maybe it is. But here's the thing. If you want to tell the story, for example, of the French Revolution, something very large like that, you tell the story of a single guy on the front lines who has a daughter and a wife at home, who has an entire career that he had to leave behind, all of these things. This is what you tell. That's the story you tell in order to really make the French Revolution something digestible by people. If you want to tell the story of something very small like the answer of a question, what is love worth? What is something like that worth? What is a single relationship worth? Well, what you do is you tell the story of, a prince who falls in love with someone else's wife and takes her home. And all of a sudden you have the Trojan War. Because the question is very, very small, one person's love, you tell the story of a very, very big thing, and the Trojan War, and in which maybe not immortals, in which men who were more than men died, lands fell, people were cast out, right? All of these different things happened in those stories because of one small question up front. The question, maybe even as small as the question of fidelity, if that could be said to be a small thing. Emily Dickinson did both. How? Well, I'm going to read a couple different poems that kind of go over what that means. I died for beauty, but was scarce adjusted in the tomb, when one who died for truth was lain in an adjoining room. He questioned softly why I failed for beauty. I replied, and I for truth, the two are one, we brethren are, he said. And so as kinsmen met at night, we talked between the rooms, until the moss had reached our lips and covered up our names. You have an I. That is a terrible color to highlight. What was I doing with that? You have an I. You have a one. You have two individuals here. They are representing entire words. They are representing beauty. They are representing truth. Now, I said the small thing earlier. To tell the story of something small, you tell a very big story. And the question was love. That's a single word, right? Beauty, but it was the love of a single individual. Here you have beauty, the entire word. Here you have truth, the entire word. Those are big ideas. You tell them through single individuals. You tell them through the small, but you get down to the place where we are talking about a single conversation. Because after this single conversation, the moss had reached our lips. So you were simultaneously with Emily Dickinson telling the big through the small and the small through the big. The next poem, hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea. yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. Hope, that's a big thing, right? Without hope, what do we do? Without hope, you've probably heard the story about the rats, right? There was a behavioralist who was testing what hope meant. So he took rats and he put them in water where they were swimming. They were just swimming in water, nothing to hold on to, no way to get out of the water. And they would normally drown in 12 minutes, whatever it was. I don't know the exact numbers. But the next set of rats, he put in the water, and around the 4-minute mark, he took them out, dried them off, let them catch their breath, put them back in the water with no hope of getting out, and this time the rats swam for 20 minutes before drowning. That idea of hope can literally keep someone alive. That's a very big thing. But you're telling us that it is the thing with feathers. You are saying that hope is a thing. Hope is a bird that perches in the soul. So you have the big, you have the small with feathers, and then you're giving us again the small. Yet it never in extremity asked a crumb of me. That's the small, but we also had another example of the big. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. So Emily Dickinson simultaneously tells the big through the small as well as the small through the big. And that is a very tricky thing to pull off. The next thing I want to talk about here is the idea of death. Emily Dickinson, if you pick up the entire collection of Emily Dickinson, 1,775 poems, I would venture to wager there's got to be 300 of them about death. Probably 1 in 5 of these poems is about death. Why? Well, let's look at this here. One of her poems is Because I Could Not Stop for Death, and it reads as such. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun, or rather he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then, 'tis centuries and yet feel shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. So what is the deal with all of these poems about death? Well, since our species became sentient, the one thing that occupies everyone at some point is the quandary of death. So, Emily Dickinson, being as large a poet as she was, Emily Dickinson being as competent a poet as she was, Emily Dickinson being so worthy as a poet as she was, as was she. She deigned to take on the biggest ideas. She deigned to tackle the largest questions. Those questions often leading her down to conclusions that were not necessarily what you would expect from anyone, right? So Emily Dickinson was part of the real magic in Emily Dickinson is that she was so unpredictable. You didn't know what she was going to say in any of these poems. There's an element when you start reading Charles Bukowski, an element of predictability. You know this poem is going to go somewhere nasty. You know this poem is going to go somewhere that the speaker has screwed something up with. Shakespeare, you know that the iambic pentameter is going to be there. You know the A-B rhyme scheme. With William Blake, you understand that we're going to get something kind of psychotic and religious in a Heaven's Gate sense. With all of these different writers, there's some element that you can predict. But Emily Dickinson, even when you know, well, I've read 3 consecutive poems that were not about death, it's likely this next poem is going to be about death. You didn't know what you have no idea what she's going to say about it. The unpredictability, or you don't know what that conceit is going to be. So, sort of in that way, her poetry is a lot like John Donne. And maybe I'm just not familiar enough with John Donne to really understand the predictability behind his poems, but he seems to me to be a fairly unpredictable guy. In that nothing feels random, but you don't see it coming. Emily Dickinson is almost to the point where things do seem random, but by the time you get to the end of the poem, they are not. One of the reasons why they are not random, one of the reasons why they may seem to be random is number 3 here. Emily Dickinson doesn't care what you think. Emily Dickinson was a nihilist. This is a poem. Every time I read it, I find myself either breathing heavily with anger, with righteous indignation, or because I feel like I'm about to lose it and cry. I'm seated. I've stopped being theirs. The name they dropped upon my face with water in the country church is finished using now. And they can put it with my dolls, my childhood, and the string of spools. I've finished threading too. Baptized before without the choice, but this time consciously of grace, unto supremest name. Called to my full, the crescent dropped, existence's whole arc filled up with one small diadem. My second rank too small the first, crown crowning on the father's breast. A half unconscious queen, but this time adequate, erect, with will to choose or to reject, and I choose just a crown. I do not throw around the accusation of nihilism lightly. Not because I have a distaste for nihilism, but rather quite the opposite, because nihilism is something very near and dear to me. I think, in my opinion, nihilism is greatly misunderstood and misrepresented on the scale that only the internet could pull off. There is a quote from Dmitry Pisarev, one of the early Russian nihilists and literary critics, who talked about this is the maxim of our camp. Strike out right and strike out left. No harm can or will come of it. What will smash to smithereens is no good. What will withstand the blow is good. Either way, no harm will come of smashing out right and left. So get to work, baby, because we have to find out what is real. In my opinion, this is basic, in my opinion. This quote is essentially the scientific method in philosophical form. It is saying, look, there are all of these sort of ideas and structures in the world. Don't just accept them. Test them. Figure it out. You don't like the idea of organized religion? Figure it out. Test organized religion. Test what it means to not be an organized religion, and see what you think. And what ends up happening, you don't like the Democrat and Republican sort of divide in the country. Well, try something else. Try third party. Try XYZ, whatever it is, right? There are quote unquote authorities in the world. Don't just accept them as authorities. That is the nihilistic principle. Now, the second half of that is What will withstand the blow is good. So, once you decide to start testing things philosophically, you have to have your eyes open to the fact that, hey, sometimes this stuff is good. Sometimes this stuff does work. It doesn't just have to fall apart because it falls apart, even. If it falls apart, it might be that nothing in that case will withstand the blow. Now, that sounds awfully ambiguous. I understand that. But what I'm saying is there might be places in life where there is a best answer, but not a solution. And if you have a place in life where you find a best answer, but not a solution, you have to make the choice for yourself. Do I accept the best answer, or do I search for a solution? This sort of leads us to the number 2 idea on this list, and that is the religious ambiguity in Emily Dickinson's poems. And what I'm talking about here, there are no shortage of poems from Emily Dickinson where if you read it, you say, yeah, but she's talking about the greatness of Christ. But if I read that with a sarcastic tone, then all of a sudden, this is not a pro-religious. This is a very anti-religious poem as opposed to a pro-religious poem. That's not what I'm talking about. Those things are obviously interesting to read into the poems and figure out, but here's what I mean. This is, I believe, poem 1550, 1551, 1555, something like that. Those dying then knew where they went. They went to God's right hand. That hand is amputated now, and God cannot be found. The abdication of belief makes the behavior small, better, and ignis fatuus than no illum at all. Now, this is a poem that you have to say, if you take this poem at face value, this is an anti-religious poem. This is a poem, however, that you could grant a reading to, where Emily Dickinson is attacking not the idea of religion, not the idea of God. Certainly, you could make the point that she's not talking about attacking the Christian God and saying that God cannot be found in that fashion. What you can make the argument here, obviously, that Emily Dickinson could be talking about a specific sect of Christianity, as was kind of the case in Emily Dickinson's day, where sects of Christianity would attack each other more than other religions. There were really no other religions around. But you have to make that case for this poem. This poem reads overtly anti-religious. Not necessarily the case. I think that you can make all sorts of cases with all sorts of Emily Dickinson poems, but this poem certainly on the surface level reads as an anti-religion poem rather than many of the pro-religion type poems that Emily Dickinson had. So this is interesting to me because, as I've talked about on the channel before, I think she wrote poetry from our earliest estimate to our latest estimate for around 47 years, something like that. So 5 decades of writing poetry. You think that you don't struggle with ideas of God on a day-to-day basis? Now stretch that struggle out over the course of 5 decades, half a century. And it's really interesting to read someone who is, it feels all over the place on certain topics, but really no more scattershot than any other person. It's just that we have these poems from one of the greatest minds that ever lived in order to read them and come to terms with their feelings at the time the poem was written, but that's not how we do it. Right? It's difficult to accept things in that way. You want to look at this and say, what did Emily Dickinson think about God? And you want to be pointed towards poem 1473 and say, oh, okay, Emily Dickinson was a back row Baptist who didn't believe in the divinity of Mary on Thursdays. But That's not what we have. What we have is a very compelling and robust idea of God, a very robust and idea of philosophy, of religion in general, of any number of things that Emily Dickinson wrote about, bees. We have all sorts of different takes on the same topic because we have what we believe to be all of her poems. So it's very interesting to me that especially in a world that is today so divided. Everyone is A or B. Everyone is right or wrong. Everyone is red or blue, Republican or Democrat. All of these sorts of things, and it's all just so damn boring. Just boring, right? Who wants to live their life through other people's definitions of something? When you say, oh, I'm a Democrat, what you're saying is that I believe by all of these different principles set out by someone else. Who wants to do that? When you say I'm a Republican, it's the same thing. When you say I'm a Baptist, there is a certain thing you mean by saying Baptist versus Catholic. Why define yourself in that fashion? Why define yourself in the words of someone else? Emily Dickinson constantly refuses to do this. Emily Dickinson, through 1,775 poems, I can tell you things she thought at that moment. I can't tell you what Emily Dickinson thought overall about absolutely anything. And the last thing, the fifth of 5 points that I want to talk about with Emily Dickinson is this. Emily Dickinson is the ultimate flipbook poet. What do I mean by that? I have here with me Emily Dickinson's complete poems, 1,775. I can open these up at any time. Poem 791. God gave a loaf to every bird, but just a crumb to me. Okay, I'm in. I dare not eat it, though I starve. My poignant luxury. To own it, touch it, prove the feat that made the pellet mine, too happy for my sparrow's chance for ampler coveting. It might be famine all around, I could not miss an ear. Such plenty smiles upon my board, my garner shows so fair. I wonder how the rich may feel, an Indiaman, an earl. I deem that I, with but a crumb, am sovereign of them all. So we have the idea of God that we talked about. We have the idea of not accepting authority, being a nihilist that we talked about. We have the idea of telling the big through the small, being a bird, getting a crumb from God. We have the idea of the small through the big, a tussle with God himself, an argument with God himself. God gave me a crumb, and I'm not even going to eat it, baby. We have all of the things that we've talked about from Emily Dickinson in a randomly selected poem from Emily Dickinson. So one of the things that I think is, and the specter of death was in there as well. One of the things that, with famine, one of the things that I think is a reason that literature is dying is and I know this is a cliche thing to say, the ever shrinking attention span. But I honestly don't believe that is I don't believe that's as final a diagnosis as there is, right? Before I went off to college, so I didn't go straight to college. I had to put myself through community college while working full time and working 2 and 3 jobs and paying rent, all this stuff, right? Before finally being able to have saved enough money that it was plausible that I go off to college and get an education in something. During that time, right after high school, working a less than ideal job, doing community college courses, oftentimes picking up a second job, my attention span outside of all of those things was null and void. It was very difficult for me to concentrate on anything. I built that up through reading. It's difficult to start reading through novels and history books and things like that. It's very easy to start reading through something that is going to be done in 30 seconds. You can read a poem in 30 seconds. You're not going to take much from it, but you will have it done and you will have taken something from it. Poetry, in my opinion, is the answer to getting literature kickstarted, is the answer to getting a world of difference, a world where we accept one another, kickstarted. It seems that we are so far away from those things right now, but simply by dedicating ourselves, and I know that this is all hippy-dippy, wishy-washy, to something so simple as reading a poem a day, Emily Dickinson is the perfect poet for that. You do not have to read these poems in order. You do not have to read any of these particular poems. Some of these poems, by the way, aren't going to make sense. They're just not going to make sense until you sit down with them and you spend 30 minutes with them. But simply by the act of picking up a book and reading, simply through the act of trying to interpret a poem, simply through the act of reading a little bit of literature and having something upon which to reflect when you lay down to bed that night, instead of all of the stupid things you said, all of the dumb things you've done in your past, all of the ways that people treated you on the way through your day, instead of focusing on those things, if we have just another random poem from Emily Dickinson. He who in himself believes, fraud cannot presume. That's a good one. Faith is constancy's result, and assumes from home. Cannot perish through it fail every second time, but defaced vicariously for some other shame. If you sat down to ruminate on that, and how to better know yourself in that way, versus all of the stupid things that happened to you, all the ways you got embarrassed today, all of the things you're failing at. Concentrating on a little bit of literature, always, at least for me, puts me in a better state of mind. I think that a little bit of Emily Dickinson every day for everyone would go a very long way. That is all I have for this video. If you like or appreciate what it is that I do here, hitting a like button really does help me out, as it tells YouTube to share this video with other literature lovers. If you find yourself here by chance but not design, literature is the only thing I talk about on this channel. There's poetry every Monday. And if you care to, hit the subscribe button, because I'd love to have you back for the next one.